grew up almost total isolation. My brother was 10 years older than me and left by the time I was 5 years old, and I lived with my grandparents, and they would take me every summer to go to a house up by a lake where there were not even no other kids, but no other people around. So I would spend my 3 months every summer in almost total isolation just with my old grandparents. And so that was drawing comics and thinking about art and the world was a way of kind of filling my time and dealing with that kind of crippling loneliness. You know, and now people go, well, you have a family, you have a wife and a child, you know, why would you be lonely? You have all these friends. And it's like, no, it's really how you feel when you're 7 years old that comes through, not how you feel later in life. I grew up reading actually comics older than I am. They were my brother's that he left for me when I was a little kid. And in that era, the 1950s, it wasn't just superheroes. In fact, there were very few superheroes. It was crime, war comics, romance, comics for kids, comics for adults. It was this whole broad range in the way there would be for movies or television. And so I that was kind of my basis in comics, was the idea that it can be any subject, but especially in these kind of easily understood genres. You know, they had to have something on the cover that made a reader go, oh, it's a science fiction comic, I like that. And so I just love that world of these specific genres, and I'm always kind of trying to think of stories through those filters, and then, you know, then they turn into something else. They often start, my stories often have like the opening images, it's a horror comic or something, and then by the time you get into the story, it's just like a naturalistic, you know, like a Eric Romer movie or something. You know, it's very different than, but I think genres and differing kinds of styles are something that comics can do that no other medium really can. It's very, if you read a novel and the novelist is writing in all different styles throughout, you know, you have to be James Joyce to pull that off. It's very difficult, or it's mostly just annoying. But in comics, if the story has a solidity to it, the drawing doesn't, it's like the drawing will almost become invisible. Like readers will, I've had readers read Wilson, and then I'll say something about the different styles, and they'll say, oh, I didn't even notice that it was different style, because they're just reading the beats and they just get into it. Their brain shifts every page. I'm always interested in primarily the story, the flow of the story. I think that's the essential thing. You need to have people turning pages and wanting to know what happens next. I think that's sort of the primary concern, but then everything else is the actual importance and the fun of the project. You know, everything that gets layered onto that. You know, I always find it very corny when people use jazz metaphors, but it really is a lot like that, where you have a solid through line, you know where you're beginning and moving through the middle and then ending on a composition, but then you can go off in infinite different directions along the way. I mean, to me, the comic book is the adequate medium for depicting almost everything. The only thing I regret in comic books that you can't do is sound, music. You know, that's the thing. When I watch a movie, every once in a while I'll be invited to see a movie before they put the music on, and it's got a real flatness to it, and it feels very unemotional. You don't quite know how to feel. And I think like that's what I'm up against with a comic. I have to do a movie without music or sound effects or anything. I often think about if I have a comic and I'm drawing, say, a room, to introduce a story, I think an author has to say, like, they were in a room built in the 18th century, there were 4 chairs, there's 3 people standing, you know, they have to describe every detail to get it in your head what kind of room. And I can just draw the room and then start the dialogue. It's more like a play. Partly you're also turning text into images. You know, there's the way they are presented in word balloons, you know, and the way they exist on the page. You know, when I'm drawing, I put as much effort into drawing the letters and drawing the shape of the word balloon that's speaking as I do into the actual drawings themselves. I find it magical when artists are sort of illustrating their own words and thoughts. You know, nowadays a lot of people use computers to do the lettering, and to me that's like allowing a machine to speak your voice. It is so alienating to me. Whenever I see a comic that has that computer font, I always imagine the characters are speaking like robots and not, there's no edge of humanity. I think, well, you know, comics are not designed to be on a wall. So it's a little awkward in that way because some of the best comics in print look very unimpressive 20 feet away. And, you know, my own comics, I try to draw them in a range where they will relate to the printed book, because that's sort of the final piece of art. But there's also a great magic to comic book pages, because they, you know, if you see a painting in a book, you may have some connection to it, but you probably won't have a real great feeling for it until you're actually standing in front of it and you can see it. It's very different in a book. But in a comic, you may have read this story and felt the full emotion that was intended, and then to see the page in person, it's you know that a good comic book page, the author struggled over that for days and days, and you can feel it in the work. And to me, and I feel this with a painting as well, to share the space of this artist is such an incredible feeling. And I had an exhibition of my work at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, and I got to see people sort of engaging with it, and you'd see people who didn't really know anything about it, and they just sort of look at it and they might read it and chuckle. But the people who had read it before, you'd see, you know, it was like you know, like seeing a famous actor in person or something. It just had this magical quality. So it's, I don't know, I think it's a very different experience than just mounting an exhibition of sculptures or something that's meant to be there. I like books. You know, books are my favorite thing. I don't necessarily love the format of comics. It felt like something that was more vital in the beginning, I think. I feel like comics never had sort of their own classical period, you know, the way, say, Hollywood films did. You know, Hollywood starts out with silence and then kind of finds their way into the studio era, where there's 20 or 30 years of just very well-produced classic movies coming out that all are made by people who really knew how to make movies with, you know, just perfect costumes, stage design, everything. And it's not like they're the great movies, but it's a period where you can see people, you know, completely understanding the form. And I feel like comics kind of skipped that whole phase. And so I'm sort of trying to do comics that are as though they're done during this lost phase of history, but with subject matters that interest me. You know, I don't want to do costume dramas and you know, pot boilers, but I want to do things that living in modern America, you know, run through your head at all times. You know, we live in a psychotic country, and I've always felt it. I've always felt how crazy America was, and it's only in the last 10 years or so that my vision has come to be reality. You know, I used to think some of my early work, they could never make it into a movie. It's just too far out there. And now I feel it's almost too late to make it into a movie. It's not even, it doesn't even conquer the moment. As a friend of mine said, we really just deserve Trump. Like he's just like we manifested him. And it's, he's such a pure American character, like a charlatan and a scam artist and a liar and a bragger but he's such an iconographic representation of sort of the worst of America. But then when in 200 years, if we survive and we look back, everybody will think like, what a great character.